The devastating clash at Bin Plin Guyen had ended, leaving the Imperial forces in a desperate, chaotic retreat. Trailing closely behind them, a colossal horde of terrifying conquerors relentlessly pursued the battered defenders through the thick mud. Leading this agonizing tactical withdrawal, the young sovereign looked back, his heart heavy with the staggering cost of survival. Meanwhile, the Supreme Northern Commander roared furiously from the rear, demanding the absolute extermination of the fleeing Southern Army. However, as the frantic chase continued, the invaders suddenly plunged into an entirely unfamiliar and dangerously unforgiving environment. Instantly, the brutal tropical heat and suffocating humidity wrapped around the heavy armor of the northern warriors like a furnace. Making matters worse, the retreating defenders had ruthlessly executed a brilliant strategy, leaving behind nothing but desolate, smoldering ruins. Every single granary was burned to the ground, and every edible crop was either harvested or completely destroyed beforehand. Furthermore, the invading horses, accustomed to vast, grassy steppes, quickly found themselves utterly exhausted and desperately starving in the mud. Unbeknownst to the suffering conquerors, the ultimate mastermind behind this logistical nightmare was waiting patiently in a hidden stronghold. Deep inside the shadowy jungle camp, the atmosphere was incredibly tense as the weary sovereign finally arrived to seek counsel. Facing the terrifying reality of a collapsing defense, the young ruler asked the most agonizing question a king could utter.
Our lines are broken, and the enemy is endless. Should we surrender to spare our people from absolute annihilation?
Staring directly into the eyes of his king, the iron-willed Chancellor firmly rejected any thought of yielding to the invaders.
We do not fight their steel, your majesty. We will let this harsh land swallow them alive through crippling starvation.
Trusting this ruthless strategy, the Imperial forces completely abandoned the main roads, vanishing entirely into the protective embrace of the mountains. Left wandering blindly in the hostile lowlands, the invading army's desperation grew intensely as their water supplies completely dried up. Driven mad by extreme thirst, vanguard units rushed toward village quells, ignoring the strange, foul odor emanating from the depths. The psychological warfare had successfully begun, as the first waves of deadly tropical disease silently infiltrated the supposedly invincible ranks. Ignoring the creeping sickness, the Supreme Commander ruthlessly forced his marching columns onward, his eyes locked on the grand prize. They believed capturing the heart of the Southern Kingdom would finally bring them unlimited food and ultimate glory. However, every single mile closer to the magnificent capital became an excruciating, torturous nightmare for the invaders. The dreaded unseen enemy, severe tropical dysentery, began to spread like wildfire throughout the increasingly panicked ranks. Watching from the high mountain ridges, elite Southern scouts silently monitored the terrifying collapse of the invaders' discipline. They swiftly relayed this crucial intelligence back to their brilliant commander waiting in the shadowy depths. Receiving the breathless reports, the seasoned Chancellor calmly analyzed the accelerating logistical collapse of his formidable enemy. He understood perfectly that an army without food is simply a massive mob waiting to violently implode. Knowing the critical moment approached, the young sovereign finally stepped out from the oppressive shadows of doubt. His initial fear had been completely replaced by an ironclad trust in his brilliant military advisors and loyal troops.
Let them break their teeth on our empty stones. We strike only when their mighty legs can no longer stand.
Meanwhile, the desperate invaders finally reached the towering, magnificent outer gates of the heavily fortified southern capital. Expecting a fierce, bloody resistance, the Supreme Commander aggressively ordered his heavy siege units to smash the heavy doors. With a deafening, thunderous crash, the massive wooden barriers spectacularly splintered and fell inward, revealing the grand prize. The ferocious conquerors roared in absolute triumph, flooding into the magnificent royal streets like an unstoppable black river. But their deafening cheers of victory were immediately swallowed by a deeply haunting, completely unnatural silence. Staring down the grand imperial avenues, the exhausted soldiers realized the magnificent city was entirely devoid of life. Panic instantly rippled through the thirsty ranks as they desperately ransacked the beautiful imperial storehouses for any sustenance. They found absolutely nothing but empty wooden bins, heavily swept floors, and a terrifyingly complete absence of food. Even the magnificent royal wells had been intentionally clogged with heavy stones and foul, rotting debris by the fleeing defenders. Standing in the center of the silent ghost town, the Supreme Conqueror finally realized the horrifying brilliance of the trap. The grand victory had instantly transformed into an inescapable, agonizing prison for the northern conquerors. Without a single grain of rice, the mighty invaders were forced to slaughter their own dying war horses. Even this desperate measure was not enough to feed 500,000 famished and increasingly rebellious soldiers. The suffocating tropical heat intensified, turning the magnificent stone palaces into a sweltering, inescapable oven. Then the silent assassin of the jungle struck harder, as dysentery ravaged the deeply exhausted encampment. The terrifying screams of the sick echoed through the empty halls, completely shattering the army's invincible morale.
Burn it all! Leave nothing but ashes if they refuse to fight us like true warriors!
In a blind rage, the invaders ignited the beautiful wooden structures, sending massive plumes of black smoke into the sky. However, this fiery tantrum only worsened their plight, as the blazing inferno consumed whatever little shade remained. Miles away, deeply hidden within the cool canopy, the Imperial defenders watched the distant smoke with cold calculation. The seasoned Chancellor smiled grimly, knowing the enemy's fiery destruction was merely a pathetic sign of their ultimate desperation.
Their bodies are broken. Their minds are shattered. It is time to show them the wrath of our jungles.
The young Emperor slowly drew his magnificent blade, feeling the heavy, agonizing weight finally coming to an explosive end. Silent orders rippled through the massive hidden encampment, awakening a terrifying, highly disciplined jungle beast. They moved flawlessly through the treacherous terrain, forming an invisible, tightening noose around the burning, ruined capital. Back in the smoldering ruins, the absolute limits of human endurance had been violently breached by the starving conquerors. Realizing that staying meant absolute death, the proud northern commander swallowed his immense pride and ordered a shameful retreat. The once glorious conquering force stumbled out of the ruined city, completely unrecognizable and utterly broken in spirit. Their desperate escape route ironically forced them directly into the dark, suffocating embrace of the towering tropical jungle. They dragged their heavy feet into the deep shadows, completely unaware that tens of thousands of vengeful eyes were watching. The thick, oppressive vines of the dense forest violently whipped against the exhausted, retreating conquerors. Extreme tropical humidity brutally squeezed the last remaining drops of energy from their starving, battered bodies. Deep psychological paranoia quickly infected the massive ranks as unseen shadows seemed to dance around them. The terrifying, unnatural silence of the massive green labyrinth felt heavier than their thick iron armor. Above them, elite native warriors tracked their agonizingly slow march with absolute, terrifying precision. Blindly stumbling forward, the chaotic vanguard unknowingly squeezed themselves into a treacherous, muddy, natural choke point.
Push through this cursed mud! We cannot die in this miserable, suffocating southern swamp!
However, numerous starving war horses simply collapsed in the deep mud, completely blocking the narrow escape route. Trapped in the congested valley, the Supreme Commander looked up at the towering ridges with sudden dread. Standing majestically atop the hidden cliffs, the brilliant Imperial strategist finally prepared to close the deadly snare.
They came as invincible conquerors, but they will leave as broken ghosts. Strike them down now!
Suddenly, the deafening roar of 1,000 giant war drums violently shattered the eerie forest silence. Pure psychological terror instantly gripped the starving army as the terrifying sound echoed endlessly through the valley. Before the panic could settle, a colossal dark cloud of lethal projectiles completely blotted out the sun. The devastating barrage crashed into the congested ravine, instantly shattering the remaining discipline of the desperate horde. Seizing the critical momentum, the young sovereign personally led the thunderous charge down the steep mountain slopes.
Drive these hungry wolves back into the mud! Reclaim our sacred land with absolute fury!
Thousands of heavily armed defenders crashed violently into the panicked, disorganized mass of retreating northern cavalry. Unable to utilize their superior mobility, the exhausted invaders were violently crushed against the steep, muddy embankments. Amidst the absolute chaos, the Supreme Conqueror desperately swung his heavy weapon to rally his broken vanguard. However, the deafening war cries of the southern defenders completely drowned out his desperate, panicked commands. The massive, heavily armored Imperial guards ruthlessly pushed the invaders deeper into the sinking, treacherous mud. Stripped of their deadly mobility, the famed northern cavalrymen were instantly reduced to helplessly flailing foot soldiers. Furthermore, the dense jungle environment made their signature heavy bows completely useless in intense close-quarters combat. Watching the total destruction of his invincible vanguard, the scarred captain experienced sheer, paralyzing psychological terror.
Abandon the heavy mounts! Fight on foot, or this cursed mud will swallow us all alive!
Panic spread like wildfire, causing thousands of conquerors to violently trample each other in blind desperation. The steep, slippery banks of the narrow ravine offered absolutely no viable escape route for the trapped horde. Meanwhile, the young emperor relentlessly pressed the tactical advantage, leading the brutal charge with absolute efficiency. His majestic, gleaming presence on the chaotic battlefield deeply inspired thousands of native warriors to fight fiercely. High above the massive slaughter, the seasoned Chancellor observed the spectacular enemy collapse with absolute cold satisfaction. He knew this devastating jungle ambush was the glorious culmination of his ruthless, perfectly executed starvation strategy. A loyal commander approached him, asking if they should finally offer the broken conquerors a chance to surrender.
As long as my head remains upon my shoulders, this sacred land will never grant them mercy.
Reinvigorated by his supreme command, massive waves of Imperial reinforcements poured violently down the misty mountain ridges. The crushing, overwhelming weight of the Southern Army finally shattered the spirit of the supreme Northern commander. Realizing his absolute tactical defeat, the humiliated general aggressively signaled a full, deeply chaotic, and desperate withdrawal.
Fall back to the river! Leave the weak behind, or we shall all perish in this green hell!
The sudden retreat order instantly turned the once disciplined Northern war machine into a completely terrified, stampeding mob. They scrambled violently over the treacherous, muddy banks, desperately leaving behind massive piles of heavy weapons and armor. Pursuing them relentlessly, the Southern warriors showed no mercy to the invaders who had burned their sacred homes. The magnificent river that once offered a tactical advantage now became a terrifying, chaotic obstacle for the retreating army. Driven by sheer survival instinct, soldiers violently pushed their own comrades into the deep water to build human bridges. The Supreme Commander, his pride completely shattered, barely managed to cross the treacherous waters under heavy Imperial fire. Watching the glorious enemy flee like beaten dogs, the young sovereign raised his gleaming weapon in absolute victory.
Let them run! Let them tell their greedy emperor that our sacred land can never be conquered!
From the high mountain ridge, the brilliant strategist observed the magnificent victory with a cold, deeply calculating gaze. He understood perfectly that while this spectacular battle was won, the eternal war for survival had merely paused. Meanwhile, the agonizing nightmare for the fleeing conquerors was far from over as they limped toward the northern borders. The devastating jungle diseases continued to silently execute hundreds of weakened men who survived the brutal ambush. Even their most battle-hardened veterans wept openly, traumatized by the terrifying green hell that swallowed their invincible army.
Do not look back! The trees themselves have eyes, and the shadows wield spears of absolute death!
The Supreme Conqueror remained completely silent throughout the miserable journey, deeply haunted by his catastrophic, humiliating strategic failure. He finally realized that brute force and massive numbers meant absolutely nothing against a unified, incredibly fiercely determined nation. Back in the liberated capital, the brave defenders slowly returned to the heavily scorched ruins of their magnificent home. They walked proudly through the charred streets, knowing their incredible sacrifice had successfully saved the entire kingdom from slavery. The brilliant Chancellor immediately began directing the massive reconstruction effort, refusing to waste a single precious moment.
Clear the ashes. We shall forge an unbreakable iron fortress upon the very ruins they left behind.
Rebuilding the shattered nation was a monumental task, but the fiery spirit of the victorious people burned incredibly bright. The young sovereign looked upon his deeply scarred but entirely unbroken empire, knowing a terrifying new chapter awaited them. Far to the north, the broken remnants of the invading horde finally crawled across their frozen, unforgiving borders. The Supreme Commander knelt heavily before his distant Emperor's envoy, utterly stripped of his former terrifying, arrogant glory. He was forced to report the unbelievable truth that a tiny southern kingdom had completely crushed his invincible army. The shocking news of this unprecedented defeat quickly echoed through the vast, terrifyingly powerful expanse of the Northern Empire. Back in the recovering capital, the Imperial defenders maintained absolute vigilance despite their glorious, incredibly hard-fought survival. The brilliant strategist knew perfectly well that the deeply wounded Northern Beast would inevitably seek a terrifying, overwhelming revenge. He quickly gathered his seasoned generals, firmly instilling the critical tactical lesson of their recent, spectacular strategic triumph.
Never forget this vital truth. Our muddy rivers and empty villages are vastly stronger than their heavy iron armor.
The young sovereign fully understood this heavy burden, officially decreeing endless, deeply intense military preparations across the entire kingdom. Every single citizen, from the deepest towering mountains to the coastal fishing villages, quietly transformed into a fierce warrior. The magnificent southern kingdom had successfully survived the terrifying storm, but the true ultimate war was just beginning. Suddenly, a desperate border scout furiously galloped into the royal courtyard, completely shattering the brief, highly fragile peace. He carried a heavily sealed, deeply terrifying warning from the northern borders that made the bravest generals completely freeze.
They are returning, and this time, they will bring the absolute wrath of their entire, terrifying world.
As dark, terrifying clouds violently gathered over the capital, the ultimate, most devastating chapter of survival remained agonizingly unwritten.